to the Apocalyptic Gospel Podcast, where we explore the gospel that Jesus' earliest disciples heard and what the last several decades of historical studies have clarified about this first century Jewish message.
Listeners, welcome back to the Apocalyptic Gospel Podcast. I'm Josh Hawkins, and just like always, I'm here with Bill Schofield and with John Harrigan. Hey guys, what's going on?
Hey man.
Yeah, not a lot. Excited for another episode with David.
Yeah.
He's a lot of fun.
Yep, I agree, John. Really enjoyed last episode and really been looking forward to wrapping up our time with David today. It's gonna be dynamite.
Yeah, definitely. Well, if you missed our last episode with David, go and have a listen. But let's get into today's, guys. As I said in the last episode, David C. Mitchell is a biblical scholar, a musicologist, and is the director of music in Holy Trinity Pro Cathedral in Brussels. And he's the author of several books, his most recent being Jesus, the Incarnation of the Word, as well as The Message of the Psalter and Messiah ben Joseph. So without any further ado, let's jump in with David. David, it's great to have you again.
Great to be here.
Excellent. Well, in our last episode with you, you gave us an overview of the eschatological metanarrative that's found in the Psalter as you develop more fully in your work the message of the Psalter, an eschatological program in the book of Psalms. And you broke down 5 specific things that you see as evidence for an eschatological metanarrative behind the organization of the Psalter. And they were, number 1, the overarching mood of the Psalms. 2, the function of the introductory Psalms, Psalms 1 and 2, the progress of the Messianic Psalms, Israel's scattering, and finally, the ingathering sequence. And so, to get started for our show today, jumping off of all that, could you develop for our listeners what you see as the central eschatological themes that are found in the book of Psalms?
Right. Well, I would argue, that all the major themes of eschatology are all appear in Genesis. And that may seem like a big claim, but I think it's true. I think the idea of the Sabbath millennium, that there is a week of millennia culminating in a Sabbath millennium, I think it's implicit in the creation narrative. And I think the rapture is implicit in the taking of Enoch. I think the messianic reign is implicit in the promises to Abraham. And I think the resurrection is implicit in the story of Joseph. They're all developed later. We get the resurrection more clearly taught in Deuteronomy, where the Lord says, I wound and I heal, I kill and I make live again. But all the major themes of biblical eschatology are implicit in Genesis. And I don't say we're just reading into it. I think they are actually implicit. I think if you read Genesis properly, you will find them. Then a lot of them reappear in the Psalms. I think the resurrection of the Messiah, as I said yesterday, is implied in Psalm 92. I think the Sabbath millennium is implied in the same psalm. It begins a psalm for the Yom HaShabbat, for the Sabbath day, and rabbinic literature always takes us to point to the Sabbath millennium. And I think given its context within the book of Psalms, I think that's a fair deduction. I think Korah, Psalms 48 and 49 speak about the general resurrection of the righteous and about the rapture. So these are big claims, and they're bigger than I can justify in detail here, but I deal with them a little in my forthcoming book. It's just to say that all these ideas, which so many people say are Christian ideas, the millennium, the rapture, they're nothing of the kind. They were well known to the rabbis. We find them throughout rabbinic literature, and they all have their roots in the Old Testament.
Yeah, that's true. I was reading the tractate Sanhedrin recently, and I chuckled and stopped a few times, saying these guys are almost forgetting that they're not Christians, but based on the way that they're talking about the coming of the Messiah and all the trends. They could just be local, modern prophecy teachers almost. It was quite humorous.
Yeah.
Well, and it seems like a real, it's kind of a natural apocalyptic approach to project the narrative to its ultimate end, into the future. So God does everything throughout history and, within the narrative in Genesis in light of where he's taking it ultimately in the end. So,
yeah, I mean, the Sabbath millennium, once you realize that the day spoken of in Genesis is not a solar day, you have to conclude that it's another kind of day. And before long, we conclude that it's a divine day. And since Adam dies within that day, it looks like that day is 1,000 years. And this is implicit in Genesis 1, 2, 3, 4. And so if we say there is a divine day of 1,000 years, we have to conclude there is also a divine week of 7,000 years. And therefore, there is a divine Sabbath to come at the end of 6,000 years.
Very much Jubilees chapter 4 right there.
That's right.
That's right, yeah.
David, that's great. Yeah, we're definitely on the same page and tracking with you with all that. So I have another question in how you see the Psalter moving forward and its effect or the content moving forward, specifically in the late prophetic material, maybe specifically around Zechariah, which you mentioned a couple times in our last episode. We have worked all the way through the Torah and the Nevi'im up till now, and this is the start of our section on the Ketuvim. And what we spend a lot of time doing is seeing how the idea of eschatological themes being brought up, and as they're prolonged into the future and they don't really occur in that immediate generation, then sort of an apocalypticism develops and an expectation of these things kind of culminating at the same time at the end of the age. So how would you see, we've seen it a lot in the other material, and we've really worked through the prophets already prior to having you on the show. So how would you see specifically the material here on the Psalter, the eschatological material, having an influence on the later prophetic material?
Yeah. I think the issue is there's a continual feeding backwards and forwards, isn't there, over time and over history. And if we understand that the Psalms is a book that is written over 1,000 years, remember, like I said, Psalm 136 seems to date from the days of Joshua, and yet it was redacted after the Babylonian exile. Then there's going to be feeding into the Psalms and feeding out of the Psalms. For instance, I don't doubt that Psalm 72 dates from the early kingdom period. It was probably composed by Solomon, perhaps David, but probably Solomon. Now, 500 years later, Zechariah takes it up and cites Psalm 72 in chapter 9 of his prophecy. But then along comes the Psalms redactor and takes Psalm 72 into his redacted version of the Psalms in order to elicit Zechariah's prophecy. And then in the same way, Psalm 110 is written by David, and then Daniel alludes to it in his Son of Man prophecy in Daniel chapter 7. And then the redactor of the Psalm, and I think Isaiah alludes to Psalm 110 as well. Then the redactor of the Psalms picks up the Psalm again, replete with all its allusions to Daniel's Son of Man, and places it in the high point of his collection in the book of Psalms. And I think similar links could be made with Psalm 1, that it grows out of the Deuteronomy and the law of the king. And then the Psalms redactor feeds it back into his collection as the beginning of the Psalms to show how the righteous king will meditate in Torah day and night. So I think there's a continual feeding backwards and forwards between Torah, Psalms, and prophets. Historically, they pretty much take place in that order, but as we said, the later Psalms are quite late. Well, I think Psalm 137 is the one for which it seems pretty clear that it's late, and yet there's this there's this interaction going on between the Psalms and the prophets, and the redactor of the Psalms later.
What do you think? Can you kind of elaborate a little bit more on the end of Zechariah?
Well, I think chapter 14 alludes to the Songs of Ascents. I talk about this in the message of the Psalter. The dominant verb in chapter 14 of Zechariah is Allah, which means to go up. And it's the same verb as we find in the heading of the Songs of Ascents, the Shir HaMa'alot. And Zechariah's continual references to going up, going up, going up, it takes us straight back to these Psalms of Ascents. The Allah was a technical term virtually for pilgrimage to Jerusalem. So Zechariah is talking about pilgrimage to Jerusalem. The Songs of Ascents are talking about pilgrimage to Jerusalem. And Zechariah is eliciting the Songs of Ascents in chapter 14.
Yeah, David, that's really good. I remember some of that content from the book, from the message of the Psalter. And as you just described it, it also reminds me a lot of the theme that you find later on in Zechariah 14, which is of the nations also ascending to Jerusalem, and the nations participating in the celebratory feast as a part of the redemption. This is kind of like an important thing, and you find it, again, all throughout the Psalms. It pops up in places where you wouldn't imagine it, that all of a sudden the opponents are in Jerusalem celebrating with the Lord's people. And so the interplay there with Zechariah 14 in that central theme in the Psalms is one that we've talked about before as really probably playing a much more significant role in what Christians might know as the Great Commission or the call to go to the Gentiles. It was the conviction that these people in the eschaton were going to be worshiping the God of Israel in this way.
Yeah.
That's great. So, David, how do you see, kind of the ideas, the eschatological ideas in the Psalter kind of being projected into Second Temple apocalyptic literature and how they're picked up there?
Yeah. Well, eschatology is the great theme of Second Temple literature. I remember when I was doing my Viva Voce for the PhD, which lay behind the message of the Psalter, one of my examiners came in and said, well, first you'll need to convince me that people in the Second Temple period were interested in eschatology. Well, it was quite easy to convince him. It was quite, and he was listening. He was listening. I said, look, it was everywhere. And I cited Josephus and I cited other Second Temple literature. Eschatology becomes the dominant theme of Israelite literature in the Second Temple period. And we've got the books of Enoch and Jubilees as counting off the Jubilees from creation to the Exodus in order to help us enumerate the years from the creation of the world to calculate the time of the end. And the Psalms are alluded to in several places in this literature. I think I can only give you one example that comes to mind. And again, it's Psalm 110. I would say Psalm 110 lies solidly behind the Dead Sea text, 11q Melchizedek. The central Melchizedek figure of the text is a warrior priest king, and he comes to make atonement. He comes to destroy the followers of Beliar. He comes to bring in everlasting righteousness and seal up vision and prophecy. And this is the same picture that we have in Psalm 110 of this one enthroned at the right hand of God, coming to earth to conquer the wicked. Since this priest king is not one of the sons of Aaron, his atonement implies the inauguration of a new priesthood, presumably making the kahuna of Aaron obsolete. And this is what the author of Hebrews is talking about. More than all that, the text actually identifies him with the anointed Messiah of Isaiah 61. And he's also identified with Jehovah, the God of Israel. So what we have in this, in in 11q Melchizedek is a full and deep interpretation of Psalm 110, that the central figure of the psalm is Melchizedek, who is the Son of God, who is a divine warrior, priest, king forever and ever. I think Psalm 110 also lies behind the Messiah figure of the similitudes of Enoch. The Son of Man in Enoch is the one who is chosen by the Ancient of Days. He's the one summoned before the throne. Once again, we get the throne seated at the right hand of God. He's summoned before the throne of the Ancient of Days. He sits there enthroned beside the Most High. He is eternally pre-existent. He is the Messiah. He has universal dominion to destroy the wicked and to comfort the righteous. And so it's all built on Psalm 110 and Daniel 7, which of course grows out of Psalm 110.
What are your thoughts on like the relationship of Psalm 8 and the kind of apocalypticizing of Psalm 8 in light of Enoch's Son of Man phraseology? Of course, Psalm 8 gets picked up again in Hebrews, yeah. And you get a messianic reading into Psalm 8 along those lines.
That's fair enough. I can see that. I can absolutely see that. It's not something I've given much thought to. Maybe you've thought about it more than me, but I can certainly see that. Early Christian literature takes Psalm 8 as an incarnational psalm. Are you thinking of it cited anywhere in particular?
No, just the question of where that phraseology comes from, kind of the source of that phraseology, and whether it's out of Ezekiel originally and kind of wrapped and projected forward from that, or if it's the Psalms, or if it's directly from Genesis and is kind of a first and second Adam mentality, what fills Son of Man with messianic expectation.
Yeah, I agree. I don't see the Son of Man imagery being from only one source. I think its high point is Daniel chapter 7. I can easily see Ezekiel and Psalm 8 feeding into that.
Well, we love Armin Lang's biblical quotations and allusions in Second Temple Jewish literature from the Journal of Ancient Jewish Supplements, and so when you get to the Psalms, it's just page after page after page after page of references to Qumran. And so, you mentioned the Melchizedek scroll, and do you have any other thoughts on just kind of the centrality of the Psalms at Qumran in relation to the Enoch literature and Book of Jubilees also being central there?
The Psalms are quoted frequently in the Dead Sea Scrolls literature. I'm trying to think offhand. I haven't made any notes on this. There is the 4Q372 text, which I deal with in Messiah ben Yosef, where some of the Psalms are quoted in relation to the sufferings of the Messiah. Psalm 41 and Psalm 89. What is striking is Pesikta Rabati in the passages I cite in Messiah ben Yosef about the sufferings of the Messiah there, and the continual allusions to Psalm 22 and Psalm 89 in that text.
All right, well, transitioning now to the New Testament and some of the writers there and as well as some of the main characters there. How do you see some of the eschatological ideas that we started off with? Some of the ones that, you mentioned become central in the Psalms, everything from, projecting David's monarchy forward to resurrection to millennium, as you brought up, eschatological judgment. How do you see these kind of playing into the ideas of the New Testament that have come down to us as Christian theology?
How do I see the Psalms in the New Testament? Well, the Psalms are more quoted than any other Old Testament book, are more quoted in the New Testament than any other Old Testament book. And I suppose we're back to Psalm 110 because it's quoted more than any other Psalm. This Psalm 110 its interpretation is no easy matter. It should be easier than it is, but it was badly mistranslated by Jerome, and the church is suffering from it to this day. It's a psalm I've spent decades pondering. It's the only subject in the message of the Psalter on which I've now changed my mind. I used to go with the old scholarly view that it was perhaps composed for David, but now I see it's composed by David. There is no other way it makes sense as a prophecy. So I devote a lot of words. I devote some 20,000 words to this psalm and its Melchizedek figure in my latest book, Jesus, the Incarnation of the Word. In short, I have to say that despite what the scholars say, Jesus was totally right when he said that David wrote this psalm about the Messiah. Jesus meant everyone to understand that he is the Messiah that David spoke about. More controversially, I think, in his comments on the psalm, Jesus is saying that he is not David's son. And most controversially of all, I believe that in his comments on that psalm, that Jesus is saying that he is the same Melchizedek who appeared to Abraham and who appeared to David and of whom David spoke. I think he's saying that also in John chapter 8, when he says, your father Abraham rejoiced to see my day. I think Jesus is saying that this Melchizedek who appeared to Abraham was an incarnation of the Logos before Bethlehem. But whenever we find the Psalms quoted in the New Testament, they're understood eschatologically. So when Peter quotes Psalm 16 or Psalm 110 in Acts chapter 2, or when he quotes Psalm 118 and Psalm 2 in Acts chapter 4, he never considers them to be simply historical references to David's kingdom. He understands that they're talking about the Messiah, and he understands that the Messiah is Jesus. And so for Peter and for all the apostles, all the Psalms point forward. And this raises, of course, the important observation that the Bible is a prophetic book. Much of modern academic theology is devoted to understanding the Bible historically. And that's good, because we cannot interpret it properly if we do not understand it historically. But if that's all it is, what use is it? If the Bible has nothing to tell us about our future lives or our deaths or our hereafters or the things to come upon our world, what use is it? If it's got nothing to tell us about the future, we might as well be reading Shakespeare or the Canterbury Tales. So the apostles all understand the Psalms as texts which are pointing forward to the kingdom of the Messiah, texts that are being fulfilled but are not yet completely fulfilled. And I think we stand in that same viewpoint to this day.
Yeah, that's good. Yeah, the role of we've spent a lot of time in season 1 on a lot of time. I mean, relative in the podcast world, we spent like an episode talking about the role of the Psalms, just even in Peter's address in Acts 2. Because if you don't understand how he's using the Psalms, and like you said, projecting forward with the Psalms that he's using, you don't understand people's response at the end of Acts chapter 2, which says they were pierced to the heart, and they said, what must we do? But if for example, you hear him quoting a verse from Psalm 10, and not the entirety, not evoking the entirety of Psalms 110, Psalms 110. And when this messianic figure returns after this period of waiting, and he executes God's vengeance on the land, and he deals with his enemies, then you don't understand why the urgency everyone feels as he explains that they've just given the Messiah over in a very unjust way. So yeah, we spent just on that. I remember getting into Psalm 116 or Psalm 16 and Psalm 110, and just in Acts 2, because we were reflecting on what is going on as they're having this charismatic experience, and this is the thing that's right in the front of their minds as Peter's talking. He references Joel 2 quickly, and then he's all in the Psalms. He's all into basically that the Psalms are saying that this would happen to the Messiah, and then he projects him forward. This kind of becomes the culture of the birth of that early movement there.
Yep. Yeah, but he's not unique in this. I mean, the Pharisees are interpreting the Psalms of the Messiah as well. They just do not think that Jesus is the Messiah. So he's working completely within the Israelite interpretational framework.
Great point.
Even in, when we come to the Talmud, we've got these old Tanaitic traditions, they date from the time of Jesus, applying the Psalms to the Messiah, but the rabbis are still looking for another Messiah because they didn't want a Galilean Messiah.
Local politics.
Yeah, and the slur of illegitimacy that attended his birth.
Do you have thoughts on Psalm 110 in Hebrews 10?
Wow.
And how the writer there relates Psalm 110 to a continued eschatological hope? It's probably, the clearest where there's not really a reading of Psalm 110 as realized eschatology, that it's somehow happening now, but it's fairly, associated directly with the return of Jesus.
Yeah, the interpretation of Psalm 110 in Hebrews is complex. He undoubtedly believes that Melchizedek is an uncreated divinity. You cannot say he is without father or mother, without beginning or end of days, unless that is what you mean. First, let's get this straight. For a start, the translation, "You're a priest forever in the order of Melchizedek," is a wrong translation. It should be, "You're a priest forever, al divrati Melchizedek." You are a priest forever according to my promise, Melchizedek. So it's a direct translation. It's a direct address to Melchizedek. Now, the author of Hebrews understands this, but there's just one or two places where it doesn't come through crystal clear. It's something I deal with at great length in my book. It's not something I can summarize easily here, but I am absolutely sure that the author to the Hebrews is saying what I'm saying, namely that Jesus is Melchizedek, that he is the Son of God, that Melchizedek was made in the image of the Son of God, which means that Melchizedek was made to resemble the coming. He appeared in a form that resembled the coming Jesus, by which I think he means that he offered bread and wine. He was a deliverer of his friend, and he. Well, there's one or two other parallels. So yes, Melchizedek and Jesus are both appearances of the Logos. Yet when Jesus was born at Bethlehem, he was an incarnation of the Logos in flesh, in human flesh. What Melchizedek was, I think we cannot say. I'm not sure he was born in human flesh. I do not think we can say that. I think he was certainly an appearance of the Logos, but whether he also had our flesh or just the appearance of our flesh, is another question altogether. I mean, the Logos appears at other points, doesn't he? He appears in chapter 18 to Abraham at the trees of Mamre. He appears to Joshua at the walls of Jericho, before Jericho, and it's not the only appearance, but Melchizedek seems to have been a prolonged appearance over some years, and living in Jerusalem as king in Jerusalem.
Yeah, and he's and in our environment, especially like after Augustine and that period, we can almost afford to have a conversation about Melchizedek that exclusively deals with something like the nature of Jesus and the Word. But in that environment, when you're writing so close to Qumran, or some suggest even to a community related to Qumran, the book of Hebrews, it's hard to evoke a character like Melchizedek without also evoking the body of ideas that went into the Melchizedek expectation at the time. And so it's an interesting bringing together for the author. Like obviously you make statements like without father, mother, beginning or end of days. You're making sort of an ontological claim. At the same time, it's not left there simply by evoking Melchizedek in that environment. You're evoking this eschatological figure, as you mentioned before, from the document from the 11th cave, where Melchizedek is essentially what other passages might, both in the prophets and in Second Temple literature, might simply call the son of David, or might call him the son of man. But he executes God's justice and establishes basically what a lot of people would, that would be too much for Melchizedek passages, but so it's such an interesting.
No, I think that's right. He does execute justice. That's what we have in Psalm 110.
I agree. Yeah. I was going to say establish the kingdom of God, and I thought that might be a little bit more of a stretch because that's kind of to be continued. The end of those scrolls, but so yeah, it's interesting because the conversation around that, which like you just explained it, I think is dead on, and it's important. The background of Melchizedek and the way people are thinking about Melchizedek obviously is conducive to like this ontological claim about Jesus, but it would be with a comma in their world, not with a period, right? That conversation would have gone, if Jesus is this figure, this is what we can expect from Jesus, and I think that was kind of underlying in that passage as well, with the author of the Hebrews.
Yeah, and at the same time, we find after the time of Jesus, after the epistle to the Hebrews, we find this desperate attempt in rabbinic literature to try and overturn Melchizedek, to try and put him down, to try and demote him, to say that he lost the priesthood because he didn't know blessing protocol, and we find all this in the Talmud. So there is this urgent rabbinic desire to put down Melchizedek as the Christians begin to, at least as the author to the Hebrews begins to identify him with the Son of God.
Yeah, which makes sense. I was reading Neusner's In the Aftermath of Catastrophe recently, and it does make sense because as he's framing specifically the Mishnah, but even parts of the Talmud. And he's framing it as the concern really is for survival of the community, and the biggest threat in Neusner's mind, the biggest threat to Jewish survival in light of AD 70 and Bar Kokhba, the biggest threat is apocalyptic conviction. So that's what we have to do away with, and so it definitely makes sense that the centrality of a Melchizedek figure, we just don't want him talked about anymore.
Yeah. Well, the Mishnah is very un-messianic, isn't it?
Yeah.
All these traditions are buried, and then they reappear in the Talmud as Tanaitic traditions.
Yeah.
But they don't feature in the Mishnah. They're kept well out.
Yeah, it's true. Yeah, in Neusner's mind, it's because it's so, as he would call it, in the aftermath of catastrophe.
But I agree. I'm sure that's right.
Yeah, I do too.
I'm sure the impulse behind the Mishnah was to try and preserve what we have, and to record all the temple traditions, all the temple practices for the future, for the day when the temple might come to be rebuilt.
Yeah.
Yeah, all the laws of cleanliness, they're all preserved in the Mishnah.
Yeah.
For the future.
Mm-hmm. That's good. Well, we could talk about this all day. One of the things I love to do is find out again. Thank you for the advice on that. We can now get the book on Amazon, which is great. But tell us about. So the message of the Psalter was you wrote that like 25 years ago. So where
that's right, huh?
Yeah,
where have I been?
Yeah, what have you been doing since then?
Not where have you been? How have your thoughts changed and developed over time?
After writing the message of the Psalter, I had this kind of violent reaction to academic theology, and I didn't do much or write much for 3 or 4 years, or even read much. I read my Bible, but I didn't much else.
I actually just finished my doctoral dissertation, and so I have the same type of feeling.
Yeah, absolutely stuffed full of texts and books, and so I began to look at it again in 2001, and then I decided I had to do something about bringing. I realized that in Messiah ben Yosef, what I'd seen and the texts I'd been reading were known by almost nobody, and that the whole academic world was telling the academic consensus was that Israel never believed in a dying Messiah, and that Jews and Christians were both parroting this consensus, and this was absolutely not true, because in rabbinic literature there is a Messiah called Messiah ben Yosef, and he comes from Galilee to die at the gates of Jerusalem. He is pierced through by cruel foes, and there he dies, but his death atones for sin. His death confounds Satan. His death destroys death itself, and then he is raised to life again. And this is in rabbinic literature. It's not in one text, it's not in two texts, it's in hundreds of texts. So I sat down to begin to put some of this together. In 2005, I published in Biblica an article on the Four Craftsmen Baraita, on 4Q175, on Florilegium, and the Four Craftsmen Baraita. And I said that the 4Q Florilegium certainly points to a Joshua Messiah, and we could see this clearly by tracing it through to the Baraita on the Four Craftsmen. Then there appeared a series of about 6 or 7 articles on Messiah ben Yosef between 4005 and 4009. 2009, I think, yeah. Then I was working at the same time and had a young family, but I was doing this in my spare time. And then I decided it was time to put this in the form of a book. And when I got started, well, I don't always do things at the right time. When I got started, I decided instead that I had to write another book in the Psalms. So all the notes I'd made in Messiah ben Yosef then took a back burner for another 5 years until I completed the Songs of Ascents. The reason why I completed the Songs of Ascents was because as I finished the Messiah ben Yosef writing, I was getting deeper and deeper into the question of reconstructing the lost music of the Psalms. So I spent quite a lot of time on this. This book came out as the Songs of Ascents in 2015, and in that book I wear both my hats. So as a musicologist and a biblical scholar, to examine exactly how the Psalms were sung and performed. And I examined just the Songs of Ascents because they're the best little mini group within the Psalms, and also because there's a lot we can discover about them. And I propose that they were first sung for the dedication of Solomon's temple. I propose they were performed in a ritual procession up the 15 steps from the lower court to the court of Israel. I talk about the nature and the sociology of the Levitical singers. I describe all the instruments employed in the temple worship. And did you know there was an organ in the second temple? And I reconstruct something of what their music sounded like from the cantillation signs of the Masoretic text. And after that, I go back to Messiah ben Yosef. Well, everything was half written and was all there, so I published it just the next year. But actually, it was not a 1-year book. There's 20 years work lie behind Messiah ben Yosef. So there I lay out all the texts on Messiah ben Yosef from Genesis 49 right through to Kol HaDor in the 18th, 19th century. But especially concentrating on the Talmud, the Targums, the Dead Sea Scrolls, and the Apocalyptic Midrashim on Messiah ben Yosef. So that was 2016 that came out. Then after another while, I published this other book last year, Jesus, the Incarnation of the Word. My way of looking at it is if Messiah ben Yosef talks about the sufferings of Messiah, then Jesus, the Incarnation, does the same thing for the Incarnation. And if Messiah ben Yosef is interested in the Joseph Messiah, then Jesus, the Incarnation, is interested in the Melchizedek Messiah. Because, you know, the Israelites were expecting 3 or 4 Messiahs. Certainly Messiah ben David, certainly Messiah ben Yosef, and a priest Messiah. Sometimes he's called Melchizedek, sometimes he's called Elijah, sometimes Elijah and Melchizedek are 2 different figures. But Jesus, the Incarnation, deals about Jesus as Melchizedek. And I also spend a lot of time on the genealogies. It was something I'd wanted to investigate for years, and I investigate them fully to my satisfaction. I make use of an old Hebrew document called the Loeb tree, the genealogy of the Loeb family, which gives us insights into the genealogical tables of Matthew and Luke that I've never seen anywhere else. And with the help of the Loeb tree, I think I make good sense. I think I make full sense to me of the genealogies. I'm perfectly satisfied at last with why there are 2 different genealogies, what they mean, how they're both true, why Zerubbabel has 2 fathers. It's all answered there.
Wow, great.
So, and how the seed of the Messiah comes both from Solomon's line and from Nathan's line, but the male progenitors of Solomon's line are cancelled after Josiah's wicked sons are cursed, and the bloodline passes into Nathan's line. Yet the inheritance continues to go through Solomon's line.
Fascinating.
I was just wondering, David, you know, I remember in seminary, my intro to Old Testament professor was very well known, very conservative, but was adamant, you know, the Psalms are not prophetic. They do not speak about the future. They're not to be read in a prophetic way. And I've heard you speak some in other places about this, but what are your thoughts on just why there's what's the motivation in the Academy to keep the Psalms as in history and not as a prophetic document, not as, or even once you get to the New Testament, to vigorously apply realized eschatology to any time the Psalms are quoted so that they're still not in the future. They can be in the future, you know, among conservatives, the Psalms can be in the future from the standpoint of where they're written, but by the time you get to the New Testament, then they're done. And so there's almost just no room for the Psalms to speak about the future from our vantage point, you know.
Yeah.
Where does it come from? I think it comes from a multiplicity of sources. I think, first of all, there's the whole Augustinian amillennial bias that sees the future of the human race as to plod along and go to heaven. And the world will end when, you know, God Almighty turns off the switch or appears on the stage or whatever. And until then, we all just go to heaven. Then it's the end. So amillennialism has something to do with it. The academic mindset has something to do with it. You know, if you're researching archaeology and you're researching history and you're researching lexicography and all this stuff, you're doing something that's quite respectable to people in other scientific disciplines. But as soon as you start saying we have a book that talks about the future, then in a post-enlightenment world, you've become a nutcase.
Right.
And I think maintaining academic respectability has an awful lot to do with it. This is also because eschatology attracts nutcases. Huh? There are any number of people writing about eschatology, and And every new sect has got a new view of eschatology, whether it's the Jehovah's Witnesses or the Seventh-day Adventists. Right. And I don't mean bad things about these guys. I have a lot of admiration for the Adventists, but they start with new eschatological views. And the whole background of the Catholic Church, the magisterial churches, is we don't talk about that stuff. We die and we go to heaven, or we go to purgatory or limbo or hell. But, we don't talk about the future of the world because that's all there is to it. So, yeah, a combination of amillennialism and academic pride, I think. Eschatology used to be the Cinderella of the church, and now she's, in some sectors of the church, she's the queen bee. But in other sectors, she's still Cinderella. Yeah. But like I said earlier, if the Bible cannot tell us about the future, what use is it? We might as well be reading Shelley or Keats.
Yeah, good point.
Yeah, I'm a big fan of J.C. Becker and, his work at Princeton. And I remember when I first read his book on Paul's apocalyptic gospel, and basically he was just arguing that the kind of neo-apocalypticism, the nutcases that have they create their own eschatology. They're disconnected from any kind of historical studies or historical context, a lot of times charismatic in orientation. But that the reason neo-apocalypticism has gone rampant over particularly the last, 70 years is because there's an innate human need to know the future of the world and where things are going, and that the academy hasn't met that need. It hasn't scratched the apocalyptic itch well. And so I've always, I always appreciated him and his work in establishing that eschatology and apocalyptic were very much central to, the biblical writers, particularly during the time the apostles and in the New Testament, that was their general framework, and thus that was their emphasis on the parousia and the return of Jesus. That it filled that need to know kind of our ultimate end and where things are going.
I think there have also been so many apocalyptic disappointments. Around about 500 AD, everybody was, all the Greek church fathers were expecting the Messiah to come, because with the dating of creation in the Septuagint, that's about 5,500 BC, they'd reached the end of the sixth millennial day, and they were all desperate for the Messiah to come. And what they got instead was the Justinian plague and the death of half the Roman Empire, and the Messiah didn't appear. And then around about 1000 AD, well, people thought that was another big turning point, and they all thought the Messiah was going to come and the kingdom. But again, he didn't come. And we have Ellen White and all these people predict, the Jehovah's Witnesses predicting dates. Even Hal Lindsey predicted the Messiah would come in 1980 something, didn't
88.
he? But Hal Lindsey was 88, was it? Hal Lindsey was disappointed again. However, the fact that he has not yet come does not at all render impossible the fact that he will come. On the contrary, the more we hope and the longer we wait, we confess that we believe that he will come.
That's right.
And I think our own times are more apocalyptic than any other times have ever been, with a global economy which is shaking, with the dreadful threat of nuclear war hanging over our heads night. I mean, the horrific power of these nuclear weapons, with the fact that we have now reached the end of the sixth millennium from the creation of the world, depending on how we date it. But I'm pretty sure that the Jewish Hillel 2 calendar is wrong, is several hundred years late. We are. I think the signs are clearer now than they ever have been. I don't really subscribe to the idea of a pre-tribulation rapture. I think there will be a rapture, And I think there will need to be some time before the raptured return back to earth. But I'm not sure it's going to be as neat as a pre-tribulation 7 years. I don't think that's in the Bible. I can see the attraction of it, and I can even see how one of the two texts can be interpreted that way, but I don't think we can be that strong on it.
Yeah.
So I guess I'm expecting the rapture to take point. I'm hoping the rapture, and I believe from Scripture, the rapture will take place at the point when the fire is to be cast upon the earth, just as Noah was rescued before the flood came. So too the church will be raptured when the deluge of fire comes.
Well, and I appreciate, kind of your approach to the Psalms as it's a packaged number of events that happen together. It's not a disparate group of things that are happening, but it's a packaged program of a narrative that unfolds. And the apocalyptic mindset of the late Second Temple period was also a packaged reality. Yep. It wasn't a systematic theology with different ideas just kind of floating out there, but it was a very chronologically minded, culminating package of events that you don't pick apart and change, but they all kind of come together and in one package deal. So the idea of the rapture being this kind of taken out of the package is a unique event, particularly within dispensational thought, that it's, this kind of special thing. When, in Jewish apocalyptic thought, it's part of one of 10 different things that all revolve around the day of Yahweh. And it's a monumental event, but there's a whole lot of other monumental events happening at the same time.
Right. Yep.
Lastly, did you tell us, because I've been to your website a number of times, because you keep up on articles and your recent work and research and stuff, and as well as all the, some of the stuff you're doing for the church on your website. Did you mention your website yet?
No. If you want to catch up on some of my stuff, you should go to brightmorningstar.org, and that's where you'll find some of it. There's maybe not as much there as I wish there was, but I put some blogs up from time to time. You'll get an overview of what I do and how I think.
That's great.
Yeah, David, that's great. Well, we are so grateful for your insight and for the time you've given us and our listeners today. Listeners, we hope this has been helpful to you as well. And again, if you want to connect with David and see the resources he has available, check out his website at brightmorningstar.org. Well, listeners, join us next time as we continue our look at the Ketuvim in the Tanakh. Until then, God bless and Maranatha.
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 Thanks for listening to the Apocalyptic Gospel Podcast. For more, visit us on our website at apocalypticgospel.com and follow us on Twitter at Apocalyptic Gospel.